We do a lot of work with single parents and working with mothers in the community. One of the things that we talk about a lot is sexual predators. And it's interesting because it's a topic that oftentimes we don't explore, we don't really talk about within our communities. And I would say there's kind of like two levels of the conversation. Talking about, women that have had partners, men from the community where, they're well known, or these individuals are kind of seen in the kind of public light for whatever reason. And then later on have been found out to be, doing things to their children. And it's interesting because, again, we don't have these conversations because there's a kind of stereotypical narrative that when we think about sex offenders, we always think, middle class, white male that lives far in the countryside. And I think sometimes we need to kind of bring that conversation home. My work and experiences, working within the criminal justice system and seeing firsthand, individuals from our community that look like me, that talk like me, that also potentially can be sex offenders. So when I'm raising that awareness in our community, I think it's important that we have those conversations and, especially when I'm working with young women, to get them to kind of, think about when they're, engaging in those kind of intermediate type of, settings where they're getting to know, the person, the other spouse, to ask more questions. Because sometimes when we have that kind of stereotypical view about sex offenders, we kind of sometimes forget about how they potentially can be in your own household. And I remember a particular case where a family, talking mum, dad, daughter, children, and, this father was sexually abusing the daughter. And for years, this was happening. And when she got pregnant and then had a child for her father, it was only about 8 years, after, this particular situation had happened, that she actually revealed to her mother who the father was. And it was a weird one because, when people say like the penny drops, and it was almost like the moment that was said, everybody just realized that, wait, there, the child looks exactly like the dad. But you don't think of those things when, you're talking about kind of a tight-knit family and something like that would happen. So from the age of 10, 11, 12-year-olds, because she was a young mother, this was happening. And then it also kind of explained the kind of sexual behavior, the promiscuous behavior that she displayed as she was growing up. And, sometimes, we're working with young people, children, and we witness or we observe these particular behaviors. I always say that there's a backstory. And that is part of that backstory, that a lot of our children are, in households where, sexual violence, sexual abuse takes place. And we don't talk about it. We know that the statistics are out there, and I know the data sometimes is quite limited, especially when you look at black communities, people of color. The data is quite low in terms of people coming forward and talking about these things, but that doesn't show, or that doesn't represent the fact that these things don't happen, and that's the point that I'm making. So when we're kind of raising the awareness of these conversations, I think it's important that, we highlight that when we talk about sexual predators, they exist in our community. And I think the second layer of that conversation as well is, young women in our community that have older boyfriends. And one of the conversations that also takes place that I hear quite frequently is, young girls that are in high school, secondary school, in year 9, year 10, I've got partners that are 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. And I guess from their perspective, it's an older guy, it's someone that really, really likes me. But when you're looking at, underage girls, we're not having these conversations with our young men and young women either. So when we have these conversations about, paedophilia in particular, I think it's important that parents, educators, those that are in the community that are invested in safeguarding and supporting children, young people and their families, that we have these conversations. Because when you're talking about a 13, 14-year-old in a relationship with a 21, 22, 23-year-old, these are conversations that we don't have. And I think it's important that when we're talking about, as I said, safeguarding our children, it's something we need to do.